There was a period of time where teen sitcoms absolutely dominated kids' TV. Drake and Josh, iCarly, That's So Raven, Zoe 101, Lizzie McGuire, Kenan and Kel, Boy Meets World, Saved by the Bell. There was like a good 20-year stretch where these shows were the thing. Not just popular, but the biggest shows on kids' networks. They created stars and launched music careers, movie careers. They had entire brands built around these shows. And, looking back on it, it's hard to really fathom how dominant these shows really were because every kid in America was watching them. And I mean everybody. Everybody knew about That's So Raven. Everybody knew about Zack and Cody and Hannah Montana. We all knew these characters and we knew all the references to the shows, and it didn't matter where you were from, didn't matter what school you went to, and it didn't matter what kind of kid you were. If you grew up during this era, chances are these shows were part of your childhood. And it's kind of crazy because teen sitcoms themselves weren't always a thing, and in the modern day they're basically a dead genre. Netflix and other networks are still making new sitcoms, and networks are still rebooting old shows as well, but the teen sitcom genre has almost quietly disappeared. That entire ecosystem just feels gone, and honestly it's got me thinking, what actually happened to teen sitcoms? So it's actually funny to think about it now because sitcoms feel like they've existed forever at this point, but they were never originally made for kids specifically. They were always for adults and more about families for the most part. You had shows like Leave It to Beaver, Father Knows Best, I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners, adult shows, family shows, workplace shows, that type of stuff. They had teenagers in those shows, but they were more so side characters and they weren't necessarily the entire focus. One of the earliest examples people point to is Dobie Gillis back in 1959. The school and the dating and trying to fit in, all that kind of cliche stuff, and it almost feels like a prototype for what this genre would go on to be later on. It's almost like they kind of stumbled onto this idea decades before it would become this huge phenomenon, right? And later you get shows like Happy Days and The Monkees and What's Happening, youth oriented television. But if you're looking for the modern blueprint for teen sitcoms, the thing that Nickelodeon and Disney would eventually perfect, that probably would start with Saved by the Bell. Saved by the Bell is kind of patient zero for the type of formula that you would see later on. This was a pretty major pivot in TV history because networks were starting to realize that kids wanted to watch other kids their age. Shocking revelation there, I know, but before this, most sitcoms were just more adult oriented. Teen sitcoms translated that exact formula onto younger audiences. Instead of marriages, you had stuff like First Crushes, and instead of the normal office drama or workplace rivalries, you would have school drama and sibling rivalry, popularity, cliques, relationships with teachers, getting your first job, getting your first car, everything that teenagers eventually deal with. And that was a genius formula because maybe for the first time in TV history, kids could actually see their own lives reflected back at them. And once networks realized that this was a gold mine, the floodgates just opened, and you had shows like Clarissa Explains It All, Sister Sister, Boy Meets World, Kenan and Kel, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, all these 90s shows that kind of spawned after Saved by the Bell. Suddenly there was just this entire lane being carved out specifically for this genre. And by the late 90s and early 2000s, Disney and Nickelodeon were basically pushing these shows out like a sweatshop. Drake and Josh and Zoe 101 and Ned's Declassified, iCarly, Lizzie McGuire and That's So Raven and Sweet Life of Zack and Cody, Hannah Montana, Wizards of Waverly Place, and all of these shows just dominated that 2000s decade. And it really made, childhood itself start feeling like a brand in some sense. You had more Disney kids and other kids that were more Nickelodeon kids. And people always argued, I remember when I was a kid, that people always argued over which network was better. They were arguing like these were sports teams. And these shows got massive. You know, iCarly episodes were pulling like 10 million viewers per episode at some point. Hannah Montana became a worldwide phenomenon. Not only was the show huge, but Miley Cyrus became one of the biggest celebrities on earth. She had tours and albums and merchandise and movies and crossovers with Zack and Cody, you know, special events. And I think what you would see around all these shows are these ecosystems, you know. And, you know, while millennials and Gen Z didn't exactly witness the invention of the teen sitcom, we definitely experienced their absolute peak, you know, not the beginning, but the golden age. They're the period where teen sitcoms completely dominated youth culture. And it was kind of insane because it was one of the last true examples of a youth monoculture. You know, everybody saw the same episodes and heard the same jokes and sang the same theme songs. And that's a type of thing that you just don't see today. And I think this is the part people don't really talk about enough, because these shows mattered, you know, not because they were masterpieces by any means, not because every episode was just unbelievable, but because they gave kids emotional guidance without feeling too preachy, you know, without feeling educational. For example, a show like Drake and Josh isn't just about stepbrothers. Obviously it's a relatable situation, but a lot of the bigger themes there are learning how to live with somebody that's completely different than you. Again, that's one of those things that almost everybody can relate to, and especially if you have siblings. You know, these shows made growing up seem fun, and it kept things optimistic. Even in harder situations, they still found a way to spin it to have a positive attitude towards everything. And I don't think people talk enough about what these shows actually did for, you know, again, that generation. And another thing about this too is that for a lot of kids, these were probably the first sitcoms they ever watched before they were exposed to stuff like Friends or Cheers or Seinfeld or Frasier, King of Queens, you know, Martin, all this kind of stuff. These shows were basically like the training wheels for those, and they introduced us to ensemble casts and running jokes and recurring characters and callbacks, season arcs, character archetypes. They introduced millions of people to the sitcom formula itself, and that is dope. You know, I loved Sanford and Son growing up, I loved Martin growing up, but I didn't necessarily understand why I loved them, because I was so young when I was watching them. These teen sitcoms made a lot more sense to me at the time. I could relate to Drake and Josh, I could relate to these younger characters. Then eventually, as I got older, I found my way into those mature sitcoms, and I think that's probably true for a lot of people as well. You know, these were kind of like a gateway and prepared you for those more mature themes that would come later. And you know, I think, just in my opinion, that's kind of profound if you really think about it. So if these shows were so great and all this, then what happened? Well, I think all in all, the environment that created these shows just kind of faded away. Cable television is pretty much non-existent these days. Streaming is pretty much the way to watch TV now. You got YouTube being the biggest media platform on earth. You had TikTok coming out of left field and giving everybody brain rot. You know, social media has kind of become everything in this day and age, and kids just aren't on the same stuff anymore. Everybody's just consuming all kinds of different media. You know, some kids watch Twitch streaming, some kids watch TikTok, some people watch YouTube, some barely watch anything at all. You know, everything is so niche and personalized now that everybody has their own algorithm, their own feed, their own rabbit hole. And I think once that happened, these teen sitcoms lost their biggest advantage, which was shared experience, because that's really what these shows were thriving on, was that monoculture. And now that environment just does not exist. Again, adult sitcoms continue surviving because adults still crave comfort TV. Obviously, people still endlessly rewatch stuff like Friends or The Office or Martin, whatever, but younger audiences seem to consume entertainment completely differently. They gravitate towards drama and reality TV and influencers. And the even younger kids, like the kids that are under 10 years old, they're growing up in a completely different media landscape with, you know, pretty much brain rot around every corner. And honestly, it's just sad and depressing in a lot of ways, because these shows might have been one of the last truly shared childhood experiences, and I think that's something worth appreciating, because for a brief period in TV history, millions and millions of kids kind of grew up together on the same characters and the same channels. And maybe that's why these shows still feel so special to us that experienced it, because it kind of represents the entire era. And if you happen to grow up during this time, you should consider yourself lucky, because we got to experience something that television might never be able to recreate again.